G'day cocktail lovers. I recently made some videos for Rye July, helping people out who are going alcohol free for July, and in Australia a lot of people are raising money for cancer. I want to stress those people are raising money for cancer prevention and treatment. They're not raising money for cancer. To follow up on Rye July, this is really other end of the spectrum. I'm going with Rye July. Not something I invented, even though I like rhymes and wordplay. This is actually from a local whiskey producer that specialises in rye. They brought out a new limited edition and they said, we're celebrating all month with Rye July. And I thought, why not? I have a few Australian rye whiskies, which for folks around the world might be interesting. I'll give you a bit of a description of them. And I'm going to do 3 rye whiskey cocktails, some modern ones and one classic from more than 100 years ago. And they're all pretty easy to make and they're great drinks and a good way to explore some rye whiskey. I have 2 bottles each from 2 different distilleries. This is the Gospel Distillery in Melbourne. These guys actually specialise in rye whiskey, which is quite unusual. That's the only whiskey they make. And I have 2 from the Rose Distillery in Sydney. They do a much broader spectrum of spirits, whiskies, gins, vodkas, and who knows what else. But I've got 2 from each of them, and I think, although they're all rye whiskey, they're quite different, and they've each got a little bit of a story, and I'm going to tell you the story and give them a taste. This is from Rose's experimental range they call Trials and Exceptions, limited editions. This was actually aged in the casks that previously held a bitter wine. The French call it Vina. It's an Australian bitter wine though, from a distiller Maideneye. I use their vermouths a lot. This was called Nocturne. I actually had this as well. I've used it all up. But it's very interesting. It's not a vermouth and it's not an aperitif. It's not an Amaro. I suppose it's kind of a cousin to all of them, just a bitter wine. So the idea of aging a whiskey in a barrel that had bitter wine maturing in it before brings in some very interesting notes. If you believe the labelling, I should be able to taste grapefruit zest, plum, cloves and curry leaf, and just a hint of bitterness, which could come from the Vin Amer. But given I'm really bad at these tasting notes, what do I really smell and get? Typical rye knows that spiciness and yeah, maybe some deeper fruity notes. Taste-wise, that has the typical spice notes I associate with rye, and maybe a bit more like kitchen baking spices in there as well. It's really deep, rich rye. Now this one from the Gospel Distillery, their stout cask rye, 55% alcohol. These are all pretty proofy, around the 100 proof and up. This is 55%, so 110 proof. It started off, there was a rye whiskey barrel that they gave to their friends at a beer brewery, and after they made stout beer in that cask, it came back to the Gospel, and then they aged some rye in that barrel again. So it's got quite the history. It was aged 4 years. Again, I love the hype they put on the labels. I should be able to taste dried plum, rhubarb, roasted coffee bean, dark chocolate, dulce de leche, cedar and walnut, a rich creamy texture. See what I actually smell. This one is more cinnamony and even a little bit caramel than the previous one. Ooh, and taste-wise, to me, this is much more like dried fruit, raisins, and maybe a stone fruit like a plum in there. So this one's a bit fruitier and doesn't have the bitter edge that the other one has. Swinging back to Rose, this is an interesting one. This is a wood-smoked whiskey. You don't get a lot of peated whiskies in Australia because we don't have a lot of peat. You can actually get peat in Australia, and there are some Australian distillers who use Australian peat. Some distillers will import peated grain from Scotland to make a peated whiskey. There is even, notoriously, a distillery in Tasmania who makes that peaty smell by burning sheep poo. They call it Holy Shit, W-H-O-L-L-Y, Holy Shit. Despite the name, I've tasted it, it's actually pretty good. It tasted like a peat whiskey. Honestly, no poo aroma or taste in it at all. But the smoke in this comes from native Australian stringy bark trees, and the way they talk up the flavours here, I'm supposed to be able to get, obviously campfire from the smoke, and barbecued peaches and prosciutto. So they're going for a bit of a charcuterie vibe. It's very interesting because they actually matured this in both French and American casks, and then it's a single malt that they had in different casks in their distillery, and they've blended to get this product. The actual aroma is dominated by the smoke. It's not like a peat monster like some of those Scotch whiskies. There's a very nice, and I think it is like a barbecue-y smoke more than a peat smoke. Flavour-wise, this is much lighter than the other two, and the smoke comes through really late. There's a nice sweetness to it as well, and the smoke is quite gentle. This would be a very good alternative to a peated whiskey. Finally, my most recent rye purchase, again from the Gospel, they call this their Legacy Rye, and they marketed this as being for Rye July, which is where the idea comes from. This is the highest proof of the four, 56% alcohol, so 112 proof. Now the name Legacy Rye I find quite interesting. So it's double distilled. The mash bill's only 59% rye, it's 35% corn, 5% barley. It's aged in a char cask in the middle of their bond store for 3 years. Now the notes they say on this are orange marmalade, lemon curd, toasted cedar, burnt toffee, fig and leatherwood, honey. And they say best enjoyed neat. I might upset them, I'm going to have it in a cocktail as well as trying it neat. And they say this is reminiscent of Maryland style ryes. They worked with a local farmer. It's when they say the Legacy Rye, it's a very unusual type of rye. It's not the most common rye that farmers grow. Certainly not the most common rye used in whiskies. So it's a thing all of its own. On the nose, oh, okay, this genuinely smells like what the hype says. It's very desserty. There's like toffee, caramel, and fruits in there. On the nose, actually really quite different to the others. So taste-wise, this is probably the brightest and the sweetest of the four, but it really carries through. There's a lot going on. It's not one note. There is even a light smoky flavour I get on the end, which is probably just going to be from the type of rye and the barrels it was in. It's not smoky like the wood smoked whiskey. This is really interesting. Just across 2 distilleries, 4 rye whiskies, all quite different, all with their own notes. I have to decide which one is going to go best in each of the cocktails I'm going to make. The first cocktail I'm going to make dates back more than a century. It's called the Old Pal, and it has Campari in it traditionally. Anyone who knows me knows I'm not going to use Campari. I do have an alternative, Doran's Bitter de Chambray. It's just nicely bitter, not over the top bitter like Campari, as far as I'm concerned. But you do you. And I just thought, so with that bitter side, it wants a bit of robustness. I also realized I had an excess in the tasting glasses I had. So I've actually done a blend of 2 of the whiskies, the Smoky Chartreuse and the stout cask from the Gospel, and that is the whiskey that I'm going to be using in this cocktail. Here's how we make it. In a mixing glass, put 2 ounces or 60 ml of rye whiskey. Follow that up with 3/4 of an ounce, about 22.5 ml of dry vermouth. Then the same amount, 3/4 of an ounce of a bitter red aperitivo like Campari. Add ice to the glass, stir that for 20 to 25 seconds to chill and dilute the drink, and then strain it into a chilled Nick and Nora glass. Which gives us the Old Pal, from your old pal, Mr. Angry. The second of the rye cocktails is the sweetest of the 3, so I thought I would use the slightly bitter one, the Maiden Eye Nocturne aged rye whiskey from Archie Rose. That will balance the sweeter elements quite nicely, I think. This cocktail is called, or was called, a dandelion, because the original recipe said use some dandelion infused rye whiskey. I'm not doing that. I'm just going to use my rye whiskey out of the bottle. So instead of the dandelion, I think I'll call it the Toothless Lion. We make the cocktail like this. In our mixing glass, we put 2 ounces or 60 ml of rye whiskey, then 3/4 of an ounce or 22.5 ml of sherry, then half an ounce, 15 ml of yellow chartreuse, and finally just 1/4 of an ounce, around 7.5 ml of elderflower liqueur. We add ice to the glass, stir it for 20 to 25 seconds to chill and dilute the drink, then strain it into a chilled coupe. Nice simple garnish, a twist of orange peel. The different elements in this are working really well. It's going to lean a lot on which sherry you use, so use a good sherry, but give it a go, the Dandelion or the Toothless Lion. For my final Rye July cocktail, I'm going to do a Death & Co recipe. I do have a bit of a weakness for Death & Co cocktails. I've got their book and there's a lot of them online. They do make exceptional cocktails. This one's called Vina. It's a little lighter than the other ones. It's equal parts, and so there's less rye in there. So I thought I'm going to use my new favourite, the Gospel Legacy Rye in this one, and I think it's going to hold up even though there's a little bit less rye in this one. Here's how we make the cocktail. In a mixing glass, we put 1 ounce 30 mils of the rye whiskey of your choice, and then 1 ounce or 30 mils of the Amaro of your choice, and then 1 ounce 30 mils of sherry. Finally, round things out with 1 dash of orange bitters. Then add ice to the glass and stir that for 20 to 25 seconds to chill and dilute the drink, and then strain it into a chilled coupe. For garnish, we'll just do a twist of orange peel. And that is the Vina cocktail. I think this is my favourite of the three. By coincidence, the last one is my favourite. Again, because it's a little lighter with less whiskey in it. You could also have more of them if you were so disposed. But I did like all three of them. In my rating scales, I think they range between 7 and 8.5 out of 10. This one gets an 8.5. I think I'd definitely make this one again. I'd be interested to hear what your favourite rye whiskey cocktails are. Celebrate Rye July. It's not a real thing, but it's an excuse to have some rye whiskey. And who doesn't love that? Cheers.